Hey guys, Jay here with Word of Advice TV, and for those of you that don't know, I work on appliances for a living, and I always log my calls, and I briefly write why I was there and what I did to fix the problem. So I went over the last 2 years of my call logs, and I looked up all my washer problems, and I compiled a list of all the washer problems I came across in the last 2 years, and I categorized them all, putting them into a top 10 list, which problems I came across more often. I went through a total of 373 calls, and out of those 373, there's a total of 58 different problems that I ran across. Some were more frequent than others, and others I only came across once. So I'm going to go over this list with you quick. The top 10 washer problems. I work on residential washers, both top load and front load, all different kind of brands. Sometimes there's laundry centers, sometimes there's stackable washers and dryers, but for the most part they're all very similar, just residential washers that you would see in a normal household. So let's go ahead and just jump right into our list and start with the champion who's in first place, and that is a broken lid switch. This only applies to the older washers, and you'd be actually surprised how much old washers are still out there. And I personally think there's a good reason for that, and that's simply because older washers last about 3 times as long as the newer washers. So there's still a lot of old washers because they haven't died yet. The new ones, they get replaced a lot more frequently. But anyways, in first place with 28 calls is a broken lid switch. This is mainly on Whirlpools and Kenmores, the old top load washers with that big agitator in the tub. And those washers, they have a little slot in the cabinet, and you can depress the lid switch with your finger even, or with a pen or something. It's a gray looking paddle that you can press down, and on top of the lid itself, you have a striker. So what happens is, when you close the lid, the striker goes down and closes that lid switch, and then everything starts running. But if that lid switch is broken, your machine will not go into a final spin. It might agitate, it might fill, but it will not spin. So in the last 2 years, I replaced 28 of those lid switches. It's a really common problem. So if I come out to a house, it's a Whirlpool or Kenmore, the old style, and they're telling me that it's not spinning out their clothes, it's not draining, then I know that, 50% chance it's probably that lid switch that is bad. And replacing those lid switches is pretty easy. Generally, it only takes like 10 or 15 minutes to replace that lid switch. Of course, if you've done it before. If you're doing it for the first time, you can look up a video on YouTube, how to replace a lid switch, and it'll probably take you, half an hour, 40 minutes at most, I would think. It's not too bad. And the problem that came in second place is a bad transmission or a bad gear case. That one had 26 calls. So I went on 26 calls where the washer had a bad transmission, and that's a bad problem to have because generally it costs anywhere from half the price to 2/3 of a price of a new washer to replace a transmission. So it becomes a very expensive repair. Generally, if the transmission is bad, people end up replacing the whole washer. So if your washer is giving you problems, hopefully this is not the problem you're having. There's a couple of different symptoms that you could look for that will indicate a bad transmission. One of them is loud grinding noises. When your unit is going into a spin, if it sounds like it's an airplane taking off, it gets louder and louder, it's just horrendously loud. A lot of times that means that transmission is going out. Another thing to look for is if your clothes come out with gray spots on them, that means that transmission or the gear case is leaking oil out most of the time. So if there's this gray sludgy stuff, that's typically a bad sign as well. And one more thing that you could look for is you can pull the washer out, and I don't know if I mentioned this, but the transmission, what I'm talking about here, this is mostly for top load washers. One more thing you could look for is you can pull the washer out from the wall and just tip it back, and if you look at the floor, if you see any oil leakage on the floor, that's a bad sign. And if you look at the cabinet of the washer from the inside, if you see like an oil ring, like an oil splatter all the way around, that is a bad sign as well. That means that transmission was leaking oil, and without any oil in the transmission, it's not going to be long before that thing completely conks out. And replacing the transmission on a washer is one of the hardest things you can replace on it. So it is a hard job. It takes a long time. Sometimes it even takes 2 people. So if you've never worked with washers or appliances before, if you have just a little bit of experience, I would not recommend tackling a problem like that yourself if you do try to replace that transmission. But if you do go with it, there's plenty of videos out there that show how to replace transmissions, so those can help out as well. And coming in third place, we have a two-way tie with 23 calls each. I'll start with the first one, and that is a bad machine control board. Now, not to be confused with the user interface board. The user interface is usually the one with the display on it, with all the buttons and stuff. Typically, the machine control board is going to be a different control board. For example, if you have a front load washer, you have the display up in front. That would be the user interface. Typically, the machine control board will be underneath the lid, somewhere on top here. Usually on the right or left side, or sometimes in the back, is where the machine control board will be. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It controls the machine. So that's the thing responsible for cycling through all of the different cycles in the washer, when the machine should turn on, when it should fill, when it should drain, when it should spin, all of that. So oftentimes what happens is the machine control board will go bad and the washer will agitate and it won't spin, or it won't agitate, or it won't fill. It'll just do weird different things. And a lot of the newer washers will actually realize that there's a problem with that board themselves. The boards, I mean, just like any other electronics, they have little diodes and resistors and relays in them, and all of that is subject to burnout at one point or another. Those boards, as you can see, it's in third place. I've replaced quite a bit of. The machine typically will realize that there's something wrong with that board itself, and it'll throw out some error code that will tell you the board is bad and needs to be replaced. As for error codes, typically the error codes will be found, there's a manual, the tech manual will be typically found underneath either the top lid or the bottom kick panel. You can take it off and you can find a little booklet that will have all the codes in it and what they mean, or it'll be behind the panel in the front here if you have a panel up on top. A lot of times the little booklet is going to be in the back right here. But even easier than looking for that booklet and taking your machine apart is to simply go on Google and type in whatever brand you have. So for example, you could type in, Samsung throwing F11 code, and Google will tell you what that code means, and a lot of times it'll even have a little list of things you could do to try to fix that. So in total, I replaced 23 of those PCB control boards. And the other problem in third place with 23 calls is a bad drain pump. Now, typically there's primarily three reasons why I would replace a drain pump. The first one is one of the more common ones, is where like a penny or a pin or some other solid debris will get through to the drain pump and it'll wreck the impeller, the little blades on the fan that pushes the water out. For example, if a penny goes in there while that thing is spinning full speed, it could break all those fins on the impeller, and then that drain pump will just stop pushing any of the water out. So it'll sound like it's running, but it'll be doing absolutely nothing. The other problem is that the motor is just electrically fried. So it's getting power, it's getting 120 volts, but the motor is just sitting there and doing absolutely nothing. That could also mean that there's something jammed in there though. Once again, that penny scenario, if there's a penny lodged in the housing, between the housing and the impeller, it could be preventing it from spinning. And the third problem is that sometimes the drain pumps, they just start to leak. So if it's leaking water, then of course the drain pump needs to be replaced. So after I replaced all of those drain pumps, the laundry break is over. And problem number 4 is very similar to problem number 3, and that is not a bad drain pump, but a clogged drain pump filter. That one had 21 calls. This mainly applies to the front load washers, sometimes the top load washers as well. Cleaning out a plugged filter on a top load washer is a lot more labor intensive and a little bit more annoying to get to than the front load washers. A lot of times the front load washers, it'll either be behind the bottom kick panel or it'll just be visible right there, right in front of the washer, a little door that you can pop open, and the filter is right there that you can take out and clean. So the symptoms of this are very obvious when it comes time to drain the water out. If you have a front loader, you're looking through the glass, or maybe your clothes are sopping wet and it pops out with some error code for some drain issue. But basically it'll either drain super slow or it won't drain at all. It'll just run for 5-10 minutes and then pop an error code out. So what this usually looks like for me is I'll come out there and if I get lucky, the customer took all the wet clothes out. If not, they're still in there. Take out all the wet clothes, and then I get a wet vac, and I try to suck up as much of the water as I can from inside of the washer. And after that, if it's a front load washer, a lot of times that drain pump housing will have a little hose sticking out as well. That's actually a drain hose that is attached before the filter. So you can drain out most of the water in there by taking that little plug out of that hose and getting that water out. Sometimes I put a vacuum to it to help suck it out faster. It drains really slowly. After I do that, even after you suck it out from inside and from that little hose, when you take that drain filter out, still you're probably going to have a lot of water just pour out. So for a long time I just dealt with it. I put a wet vac to it and I tried to take it out slowly, put it back in, take it out, just catch as much water as I can or throw a towel under it. But I have gotten smarter. What I do now is I pull the whole washer slightly out and then I tilt it towards the wall. That way all the water goes to the back of the tub and it's not going to be in the drain pump when you take that filter out. So now I pretty much stay dry every time when I'm working on those clogged filters because I push the washer back like that. I take it out and generally that filter is full of just all kinds of stuff. One time I saw a filter with, the lady was a hairstylist, so she was getting tips. And I kid you not, the whole filter was just wrapped up in money. Like $1 bills, $5 bills. I think the biggest one was a 10, nothing bigger than that. But it was all wrapped in money, and then there was also some quarters in there, some dimes, some pennies. So the whole thing was just plugged with hair and money. So that was kind of an interesting one. And one more thing that I want to point out is customers that wash rubber back rugs. Those rugs that have those rubber little dots underneath of them? Those really should not be washed. Sometimes, you might get away with it a couple times. You'll wash it and nothing happens. But then there comes the time where it seems like literally all of that rubber backing just comes off. And that rubber stuff is going to be all over your washer, all over the tub, inside of all your hoses. It's going to completely clog your filter. It's going to be in your drain pump. It could burn it out. It just makes a mess. That's why laundry centers, the laundry mats where you bring all your clothes and stuff, they really don't like those rugs either. Because those rugs, they tend to wreak havoc on the machine. So once that drain filter is completely cleaned out, put it back in, I test it, and you can just see the water go down real quick. It's a really nice feeling. And once again, the laundry break is over. And coming in fifth place, we have a two-way tie, both of them having 20 calls each. I'll start with the first one. First one is a bad timer. So I replaced 20 timers. And this primarily is only for the old washers or washers like the Speed Queen that have the old style classic design, even though they're new. So the timers, for example, my washer right here, this has a timer. It's just a knob in the front, that cycles through everything. The timer just slowly advances as it goes through its cycles. But in the back, it's like a big box. That's actually the timer. So typically the symptoms of a bad timer will be that either some of the cycles don't work or the timer just simply stops advancing. That's the most common one. So you'll put it on some cycle and it's just stuck in that place and it does not advance. I've had customers tell me that, I turn on a cycle and 4 hours later I realize, hey, it's still running. So it'll not advance. Sometimes it won't send power to something that it should. So, it might look like a bad drain pump, but simply the timer is not sending power through to it, or it won't agitate or do different problems like that. And usually homeowners with washer problems, they say it's a bittersweet experience. They can't do their laundry. That kind of makes them mad, but at the same time, they're pretty happy that they can't do their laundry. That is until I replace the timer, and then the laundry break is over. And the other problem in fifth place with 20 calls is a bad door lock. Mainly, the door locks I replaced 20 of them. Mainly, it's the ones that are on the front load washers, but they can also go bad on the top load washers as well. This is primarily for the newer washers that have door locks on them. So for example, my top load washer, it's an old one, it's 15 years old. I don't have a door lock. So as the cycle is running, I can open the door and look at it. It might stop, but I can always open the door. But the new machines, once the door is locked and the unit is running, the lock keeps the door locked, so you can't actually open the door to take a look. Same with the front loaders. But most of the bad locks that I see are on those front load machines, so it'll lock it, but it will not release. So, then the water is standing in there or your clothes are in there, it's done with its cycle, but you can't take anything out. And the opposite problem is a little bit more rare, but it does happen as well, where the door lock will actually stay open and it will not close. And the machine will realize that the door lock is not closing, and it will not allow the cycle to continue. And I do want to mention, though, that most of those front load washer machines, they do have an emergency manual door lock release. So if your washer is stuck and you can't get the door open, a lot of times you can either pop the top open or take the bottom kick panel off. And if you reach in under or over to where the door lock is, there should be a little plastic ring on a handle or a little plastic bar. If you pull that ring, that will manually open up that door. So that's useful to know, until you can get a new door lock assembly, you can at least open it up manually. And for problem number 6, I replaced 19 door boots or door bellows. Now this only applies to the front load washers. That the bellows is basically that big round gasket that the door goes into and makes a seal so there's no water pouring out. And sometimes, that door gasket, it'll either get a rip or a tear in it, it'll start to leak. But before we replace the gasket, one thing that I like to do is look at the glass itself, that goes into the gasket. Sometimes there's some crud or some other buildup on that glass that is preventing it from making a good seal, and that's what causes the leak. So in that case, you could just take a razor and scrub that stuff off, and then close it and run it through another cycle and see if it leaks. A lot of times that's all it takes to stop that leak. But of course, if it has a tear in it or a rip, then that whole bellows needs to get replaced. Other times, if for some reason they stuck a really big load in there, or maybe there's something with zippers or something metal that can snag the boot, and that completely rips the boot off of the tub. So of course, when it's all mangled up like that, then the boot also needs to be replaced. Another thing I look for is the spring that holds that door boot. If it's really rusty, then I like to replace that spring as well. Replacing the door boot can be pretty involved. It can be a tough job if you've never done it before. And putting the spring back on can be a project in of itself too. Sometimes it even takes 2 people to try to stretch that spring out to put it back on that door gasket. There's a cool pair of pliers that they sell. If you work on washers on a regular basis and you don't have those, I would recommend getting them. They're like reverse pliers with notches in them. And when you depress it, it goes the opposite way. And it helps keep that spring spread out, until you get it in place, and then you can snap it back in. But anyway, let's move on to problem number 7. And number 7 with 16 calls is bad suspension rods or bad shocks. So this primarily affects top load washers, but it can be a front load washer problem as well. And an easy way to test if you have bad shocks or not is, if you have a top load washer or even a front load, you can reach in there and press on the tub the same way. But with a top load washer, you would press down on the tub or on the sides of the tub. I have an agitator, so I would just press down on the agitator, press down on it, and let go. And that tub should only bounce once, maybe maximum twice, as it goes back up. But if you press down on it and let go, and your tub just keeps bouncing up and down, 3, 4, 5 times, then those suspension rods are probably shot and you do need to get them replaced. Generally, on top load washers, and front load washers for that matter too, there's going to be 4 of them, 1 on each corner of the tub. And one of the symptoms that accompanies bad suspension rods is that the washer will start to bang around the sides as it goes into a spin. So because the suspension rods are weak, they do not fully hold it in place. So the machine or the tub will start to bounce around the inside of the machine or the cabinet. Just bang, 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 bang. And oftentimes, after it completely speeds up to full speed, it will even itself out and stop banging. But if you do hear that bang at any point of the spin cycle, then there's a good chance that it's the suspension rods that are causing that. And coming in 8th place with 11 calls is a bad drive belt. And what I mean by bad belt is it's just ripped. I would come out to a house, usually this is on older top load washers, you pull them out, you tip them back, and you see a ripped belt just laying on the floor with a bunch of rubber shards. Typically, you just replace the belt and everything works great. It's very rare to see a ripped belt on a front load washer. On a front load washer, the belt would be in the back. The only time those rip is if something else caused it. So if the pulley was wobbly for some reason, if it was loose and the belt was riding on the edge of the pulley, maybe that cut through it, then it might rip. But other than that, the belts on the front loaders, they rarely ever rip or tear. Usually it's the top loaders where that happens. And of course, in that case, if the belt rips, the washer will not agitate or spin. Alright, moving on. In ninth place, we have also a two-way tie, and this one's kind of ironic. Both of these have 10 calls each. One of them is a bad motor control board, and the next one is a bad motor, right? So, the bad motor control board, it's just like it sounds like. The motor control board is just there primarily to control the motor, to send power to it in different speeds, and to send power to it to agitate, to spin, low, high, medium. And a lot of times, I think it was Frigidairs. I had quite a few Frigidairs with bad motor control boards, or MCUs they call them. Those things will be in the bottom of the washer, somewhere either on the left or the right side of the washer on the bottom. So you do kind of have to take the washer apart to get to that control board. And the symptoms of that are almost like a symptom of some of the other stuff, where it'll fill, it'll agitate, but the washer will not spin out. In fact, a lot of times everything will work. It'll even drain the water out. And then the drum will just twitch a little bit on front load washers mainly. The drum will twitch a little bit, but it'll never go into a final spin. And if you have a newer washer, a lot of times it'll pop out a little error code, which will tell you that there's something wrong with that motor control board. After you replace it, everything works good. That motor control board, generally, it's not too hard to replace. In fact, I find the motor control board oftentimes easier to replace than the machine control board up on top. So it's not too difficult to access on the bottom. A lot of the washers, the whole front panel will come off, or the kick panel will come off, or a panel on the back of the washer will come off, and you're able to access it pretty easily. There's just a couple of plugs that you have to take off, replace the board, put the plugs into the new board, and you're good to go. And I already mentioned this before, but guys, seriously, on YouTube, there's videos on just about every single part on the washer nowadays. How to replace everything, step by step by step by step. Repair Clinic has a ton of videos on that. So, for example, if you type in how to replace MCU board on a Frigidaire washer, I'm sure there's going to be a ton of videos on just that alone. How to replace the motor, the timer, everything. So if you could at least narrow down what is causing your problem, or if you have some error code, just take it from there and you could find a lot of resources that can help you fix your own washer if you're willing to do that. But anyway, the second one in ninth place is a bad motor. And the motor is bad when it's getting power, when it's getting 120 volts and it does nothing. So oftentimes it'll fail altogether. It'll not agitate or spin. But I have seen some of the older washers where the motor fails just in the spin part. So it'll agitate, but it will not spin. And oftentimes if you put your hand on the motor after it's been idling for a while, when it's supposed to be spinning, if you put your hand on the motor, it'll be super hot. So in that case, you would just need to replace that whole motor, and the washer should be back up and running in no time. And finally, coming in 10th place, we have a three-way tie with 9 calls each. And I'll just start from the first one, which is bad agitator dogs. Now this is mainly on Whirlpool and Kenmore washers, the top load washers, the old style. So those washers, the agitator, if you reach into your old washer, if you have one of those, the agitator should spin one way, and then it should catch if you spin it the other way. If it spins freely both ways and you have agitator dogs, that means those agitator dogs are worn out. Now, they're called agitator dogs because literally those pieces look like little canine teeth, and they kind of come out in a spiral. And when you spin the agitator one way, they fold down, and when you spin it the other way, they pop out and they stop it. That's what causes it to agitate, So those agitator dogs, with time, they do wear down, and that one's actually a pretty easy repair. You just pull the agitator out, replace that little agitator dog piece, put it back in, and everything starts to work again. And the next one with 9 calls is a bad fill valve. And that one's pretty simple as well. I mean, the symptom is pretty obvious. If you have a bad fill valve, that means the valve will not open and let any water in. So when the washer is supposed to be filling, it does not fill. And to check it, you do have to have a meter, or at least, I guess you could try to listen to it and see if it's humming. If the valve is getting power, but it's not opening and letting the water in, then you know that the valve is bad. Of course, you always want to double check that the water is on to the hoses, to the supply hoses, before you make that conclusion. And the last one in 10th place with 9 calls is a bad clutch assembly. Now the clutch is the thing that's responsible for engaging the gear case or the transmission. So between agitate, and if your machine has multiple spin speeds, low spin, medium speed, high speed, that clutch is the one responsible for switching the gears and engaging that transmission. If the clutch goes bad, then your washer will have a problem with one of those cycles. And what causes this is usually just time, wear and tear. The little teeth on the gears start to wear down. A lot of times it also comes with a loud grinding noise as well when the transmission or the clutch is trying to switch the gears. So if you hear noises like that, then there is a chance that you have a bad clutch. Well guys, and that is it for the top 10 washer problems, and that was only like half of the list. So I think I'll go ahead and go over to honorable mentions, the rest of the list that was not in the top 10, and I'll go a little quicker on the rest of them. I won't get stuck on every single one of them. But let's just go ahead and go over to honorable mentions real quick. I had 4 calls with a bad actuator. This is only on top load washers. I think it was the Maytag Centennial and the Whirlpool Cabrio. They have a little actuator. It's usually a red little thing that actuates the clutch. And a lot of times when that actuator goes bad, it's accompanied with noise, and a lot of times the spin, whenever the washer is supposed to go into a spin, it just goes in a slow spin and it does not speed up. I had 2 calls where the door strike was broken, either on a top load washer. If you have a door strike, it would be right here. Or if you have a front loader, then that door strike would be on the door itself. I had 1 call where the door strike was loose. This was a front load washer. And the door strike, because it was loose, the door would not close all the way. And if the machine thinks that the door is not closed, it will not allow any of the cycles to continue. So I tightened up that door strike and everything was good. I had 2 calls with the bad pressure switch relay. On some washers, there's a little relay that sends power to the pressure switch, and that relay can go bad. I had 2 of those, replaced them, and it was good. I had 1 call where there was a bad wash plate. So this is those newer top load washers where instead of a big agitator in the middle, they just have that little wash plate on the bottom. And sometimes the teeth on that one, they wear down as well, and then just kind of starts to freewheel and doesn't do much agitation. So I replaced that wash plate and everything was good. I had 1 call where the power supply cord was simply unplugged. One of the kids unplugged the washer and the customer didn't even notice, so they didn't know why their washer wasn't turning on. So on that call, I literally just had to plug it back in, make sure it's working, and be on my way. The next one with 2 calls is a bad outlet. So the outlet, I think the 2 calls that I had, one of them was a GFI that was tripped, and then the other one, the outlet itself had a broken wire inside of it. That's why it wasn't working. If you don't have a meter to test an outlet, an easy way is to just take an extension cord and plug your washer into an outlet in the next drum and see if it works. I had 6 calls where the inner tub seal was leaking. The seal would be on the bottom of a top load washer, on the bottom of the inner drum. And if that starts to leak, the water gets into the transmission, and that could lead to a game over for the whole washer. So leaking tub seals are not a welcome problem. The next one with 2 calls is I replaced a rotor and a stator. So this is on a front load washer. The thing that, it's a direct drive front load washer in the back. Instead of a motor, it just has a rotor and a stator, this big disc looking thing. And I replaced 2 of those because it just stopped working. It had power going to it, but it was not doing anything. It was not agitating or spinning. After I replaced them, everything was going good. I also had 3 washers, front load washers that were belt driven from the back. And a lot of times they have a little pulley that the belt rides on in the back that comes loose. All I had to do was just tighten that pulley up and everything was good. So the tub inside was all wobbly and stuff. When the unit was running, it was banging around the sides. And all of that was caused by a loose nut in the back. So I just tightened that up and everything was good to go. I had 3 calls where I replaced the baffle or the vane, and that's on the front load washers. And the baffle or the vane is basically that paddle that pushes the clothes around. And sometimes they break off, or I don't know how it happens, but I guess with time they get warped or whatnot and they bust off. But generally replacing those baffles is pretty easy. You don't have to take anything apart, they just snap right in. So that's pretty nice about the washers. I had 7 calls where the washer was leaking, and there's a lot of different things that can cause a washer to leak. A leaking door boot, there can be holes in the hoses, there can be a cracked tub, there can be a bunch of stuff that can cause a leak. So with the leaking washer, you do have to kind of take it case by case, run it for a while, and just take the washer apart and see where you see the drips coming out from, and then try to go from there. I had 6 calls where the pressure switch hose was plugged. Now the pressure switch hose, it goes from the pressure switch to the side of the tub. And usually that little port on the side of the tub where that pressure switch hose goes into, that's where the buildup happens. If there's enough crud in there where the pressure switch does not sense that the tub is full, there's 2 things that can happen. Either it will not fill at all, or it'll fill and fill and fill and fill until it starts to spill over. And the fix for that is pretty simple. You just have to take that hose, clean the port, clean the hose itself, and you should be good to go. The next problem with 2 calls is a bad pressure switch itself. So the pressure switch, generally it'll either get stuck closed or stuck open in a stuck open position. And if it gets stuck like that, then there's not much you could do for that pressure switch except just replace it, and that solves the problem. I had 3 calls where the washer was a Samsung washer and it was on the recall list. So, I don't know, a while back, it was kind of a craze on the internet, I don't know if you saw it or not, but the self-destructing Samsung washer, I don't know if that video was real or not, but the tub would wobble so much that the whole entire washer would just kind of self-destruct. So, after that, Samsung issued a recall on a bunch of their washers and other units. So, if you're having a problem with a Samsung washer, then you might want to go on the Samsung website or just type in Google Samsung recall list washer models and see if your model of the washer or whatever appliance Samsung that you have is on that recall list. I had 5 calls where I replaced the whole agitator. This is the top load washers that have a big agitator. Either it was broken, like some of the paddles were broken off, or on some agitators they don't have agitator dogs. It just comes as the whole assembly, and the gears inside, they wear off as well. So in that case, instead of replacing just the little agitator dogs, you would end up having to replace that whole agitator assembly. I had 7 calls where I replaced the dispenser assembly. This is on the front load washers. The dispenser is usually on the corner. And that dispenser, either it'll start to leak, or it'll be so plugged up that you can't really clean it. So in that case, I like to order the whole dispenser assembly, because if you order just the dispenser, a lot of times it'll only come with the top part of it, but I like to get the tray, the bottom part and the top, as one assembly, so you can just get it all done and over with. I had 2 calls where the washer was simply unleveled, so all I had to do was just level out the legs, and everything was good. And I had 11 calls for a bad rear bearing. And I don't know how I missed that, but 11 calls actually should have been tied with 8th place. Bad rear bearing, that only applies to front load washers, and in the back they have the rear bearing. It kind of looks like a tripod, and with time that tripod or the rear bearing starts to break apart. So a lot of times you'll be able to put your hand inside of the front load washer and spin the drum by hand manually, and you'll hear in the back of the washer something clunking, almost like marbles falling or like rocks falling. If you're hearing noises like that, that's probably pieces of your rear bearing. And that's bad news. The rear bearing typically comes with the whole half side of the outer tub, and replacing that is a bear. Usually it takes 2 guys and at least 2 hours. By the time it's all said and done, the cost of that repair is probably not worth it, and you're better off just getting a new washer. I had 1 call where the button was stuck, and this one kind of threw me on a loop. It was a control panel in front on a front load washer, and half of the buttons were not working, and I couldn't figure out why. And the button, it was depressed just slightly, so you can't really see it. So the way I figured out that the button was stuck is, I was starting to run out of options. I'm not sure what's going on. I started pressing each of the buttons to see which buttons worked and which buttons don't. And when I got to that button, I noticed that it wasn't pressing in at all. So that's when I figured out, because that button was stuck, all of those options on that side of the panel were not working. So after I freed that button up, everything started working great. I had one call where the dampening strap was ripped, and this only applies to GE top-load washers. They have 4 black rubber straps on each corner of the drum, and they kind of hold the drum in place so it's not banging around the sides. And sometimes either an unbalanced load or for some other reason, one of those straps, sometimes even 2 of them, will rip, and that's when your tub starts to bang all over the place. You replace that dampening strap and you're good to go. I had 5 bad motor couplings, and this only applies to Whirlpool and Kenmore. The old washers, the top loaders, they have a pump in the front, the motor's on the bottom. It usually has a drain pump in the front, it has the motor, and then the transmission. And between the transmission and the motor, you have the coupler. It's just a round rubber piece with these plastic bearings going into it. And that rubber piece falls apart with time. So oftentimes if you pull the washer out and just tilt it back, if you see rubber shavings underneath the motor, that means likely that coupler is worn down and you'll need to replace that coupler kit. I had one call where the inlet screens were plugged. So where the hoses go into the washer, the supply hoses, where they go into the washer, there's little screens there. And those 2 screens were completely plugged with these black little rocks or sand or eggs or whatever that was. It was weird. It was like almost like small black caviar. The screens were completely plugged with that stuff. And the customer was telling me that he had it in the sinks, he had it in his toilet, and he wasn't sure what was going on either. All he knew was that they flushed the fire hydrants the day before. So if that had something to do with it, I don't know. But I cleared those screens out, put the hoses back on, and everything worked great. I had 2 calls where the water was turned off to the washer, and that was the only problem. So the customer complaint was, my washer is not filling. And either somebody else turned off the water or Dave had forgotten that they turned off the water. All I had to do is turn the water back onto the washer and it started filling and working properly once again. I had 4 calls where the door hinges were either completely broken or loose and I could not tighten them up so they're tight. A lot of times it'll be on the front load washers. That front door gets really saggy and you can't really tighten it up. It happens on the top loaders as well, but not as often. So I replaced 4 sets of those hinges. I had 3 bad user interface boards. So out of all the control boards, the machine control board, the motor control board, and the user interface control board, that user interface board fails the least often. So I had 3 of those. Usually if those user interface boards fail, some of the buttons won't work, they'll stop working, or the display is going to go blank. Either the display goes blank, even though it has power going to it, or like half of the display will be on, or maybe some cosmetic damage if the user interface panel comes with the board and it's just completely busted up, then we would replace that as well. So I replaced 3 of those. I had 4 calls where I simply had to clean the holes on a front load washer on the dispenser. So the dispenser is on the side. I touched on that a little bit earlier where I replaced a whole assembly. But sometimes you can take a wire or even a toothpick, take out the dispenser tray where you put all the soap in, and you'll see a lot of holes on the top of that dispenser. Those can get caked with debris and dirt and grime and whatever else. Oftentimes, if you're having problems with the soap not dispensing or something like that, some of those holes could be dirty. If you just clean them out with a toothpick or a piece of wire, that might be all that's needed. I had 3 calls where I replaced the supply hoses going to the washer, and either the supply hose was in really bad shape or it was leaking altogether. We recommend the steel braided ones, not the rubber hoses, because the rubber hoses, if your washer is pushed close to the wall, they tend to rub holes in them and start to leak. So, the steel ones, they work a lot better because there's pretty much a guaranteed chance that you will not have a leak. I had 3 calls where I replaced the basket drive. Now, the basket drive, or also called the spin tube, is basically the tube on a top load washer where the shaft from the transmission sits in. So the transmission shaft goes through the spin tube. And then the thing that tightens it down is a drive block. I had 2 calls where I replaced that drive block because it was worn down, or it's so caked on there that when I took it off, I couldn't put that old one back on, so I had to get a new one. I had 3 calls where I replaced the front panel on a front load washer, and that has nothing to do with the user interface. some of those panels, they come off and the user interface board is underneath. If that is completely damaged, then we could replace that as well. So I replaced 3 of those. I replaced 1 complete door. That one was kind of odd. When I came there, the whole door was just broken. It was on the floor in pieces. And I could not put that door back together. So I ended up ordering a whole, the front of a front load washer, the door and that panel, to replace it. Kind of an expensive order. I had 2 calls where the problem was suds, or in other words, bubbles. And of course, I would come out to the house, I would turn the washer on without putting any soap in, and all of a sudden bubbles will just start coming up like crazy. And usually the reason for that is people are using too much soap, or they're using the wrong kind of soap. And one thing I want to point out about that, if you have a new washer that's HE, or high efficiency, you should be using HE soap, not some other soap. I had 2 calls where the outer tub to the drain pump hose, which is usually a big ribbed hose that kind of narrows down as it goes to the drain pump, literally had a hole in it. And it's a big hose, so if that has a hole, that usually creates a lot of water. So I had 2 of those calls, a ton of water. You replace that whole hose and everything's good to go. I went on 4 calls where I had to replace the knob, and either the knob just got brittle with age, or perhaps the homeowner went beast mode on the knob and accidentally broke it. So 4 knobs that I replaced. I had 1 call where I had a bad on-off switch. So it's almost like on my washer. I have this start button. So I had 2 calls that I went on where this button just stopped working, and I had to replace the button in the back to get it to work again. I went on 7 calls where the parts that I needed for the washer were no longer available. And of course, if I can't order the parts, I can't fix the washer. A lot of times the part that is not available is a control board. Sometimes it'll be a motor, but usually if there's an unavailable part, maybe it's a really old washer, but oftentimes it's the control boards that get you. I had 1 interesting call where it was a top load washer, very much like my GE washer right here, with a magnetic lid switch, and the unit was not going into a final spin. Took me a while to figure it out, but the reason it wasn't going into a final spin was simply because there was a little pin stuck on the bottom pad right here, which was causing the magnet up on top here not to make a full connection when the lid was closed. So that's all it was. When I took that little pin out, everything started working great. I had 1 call where the injector assembly was leaking, and I'm not sure why I put that separate. That should be just in the same category as the washer leaking. But the injector assembly is basically a plastic little piece where all the water supply hoses go into before they go into the dispenser. That thing was leaking. So I replaced that and everything was good. I had 1 call where there was a hole in the inner basket, almost like somebody took a big rock and just threw it inside the tub. There's just a big hole inside of the inner tub. So the whole inner tub would have had to be replaced, and the cost of doing that was ridiculous, so the customer just ended up getting a whole new washer. I had 2 calls where the outer tub was cracked. This is on top load washers. So you have the inner tub, which sits in the outer tub, which holds all the water. So the outer tub, in both cases, was cracked on the bottom, along the bottom there, and water was leaking out of there. And unfortunately, with that, it's also a very expensive repair if you want to get that repaired. So the whole washer got replaced in both scenarios. I had 2 washer calls where the outer tub on the front load washer was not a circle, but it was more like an oblong, like an oval. And of course, if the outer tub is not a circle, if it's oval for some reason, if the plastic is deformed, then it throws everything else off balance as well. So in both of those cases, they also needed to get a new washer. And the last one is a bad speed control switch. In both cases, the machine was stuck in a slow spin instead of a medium or a high, so the clothes would never really completely get wrung out. They would still be kind of wet when the customer took them out. So in both cases, all I had to do was just replace that speed control switch, and everything started working great. Well guys, and that is it for the washer problem list. That was so many washer problems, I'm starting to lose my voice just listing all of them. So of course there's many different brands of washers, many different styles, many different kinds, and they keep coming out with more and more. They keep adding more things to them. You know, all the steam and all the other stuff that they add to those washers, that's just another thing that can go wrong, another thing that can break. So there's just a ton of different washer problems that you can have. And the stuff that I listed is just a part of it. So the purpose of this list was more to show you the common trends, what is the most common washer problems, what I, as a technician that worked in washers, saw the most of. So, finally done with the video, explained all the problems that I came across myself. Now, if you have any washer stories of your own that you could share, if they're good stories or bad stories, if it's a self-destructing washing machine, or if you had a washing machine that walked across the floor, if you had some other wild washer stories or experiences, or if you're a technician that works in washers, if you have some stories about washers, all of that is welcome in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to mash that like button on the way out, and we'll see you next time. And if you're still here and not in the comment section below, I'm going to Hawaii right now and thought I would make you jealous by showing you this aerial shot from the airplane window, is what I would like to say. But I'm actually about to do my laundry.